has often been referred to as the Forgotten War, which is unfortunate because, number one, it was a war in which the United States suffered heavy casualties, over 30,000 killed, many more times that wounded. It was also a war which in the last analysis was successful. We prevented the loss of South Korea to communism, and in doing so, we helped to stabilize all of Asia in the decades that followed. So it is regretful that the Korean War veterans have not, by and large, gotten the respect that they deserve for this great accomplishment. We hope in our small way to redress this oversight at this conference with this panel. And to moderate it, I'd like to introduce Colonel Warren Wiedhahn, who besides being a veteran of the Korean War and executive officer of the Korean War Veterans Association, is president of Military Historical Tours. And we work with Warren now for a number of years in his annual tour of Guam and Iwo Jima, and we'll be doing so next year. He's a great American, great patriot, and great hero. So please welcome Colonel Warren Wiedhahn.
Thank you, Jim. It's just the way I wrote it. Very few of us can remember where they were 56 years ago. As a matter of fact, looking around the audience here, there are very few of us that were around 56 years ago. But I can remember where I was. I was in a bar in San Diego, California, drinking root beer. Well, maybe something a little stronger than root beer. But it was the Saturday evening, the 24th of June, 1950. I had just come back from Tsingtao, China after 2 years, and was getting ready to get out of the Marine Corps and go back to college. When the bartender came over and said, hey, you two Marines, get back up to Camp Pendleton. We're going to war in Korea. And I said to my buddy, where's Korea? Which is true. And I'd spent 2 years in China, very close to Korea, but Korea in those days was just not on our radar screen. It wasn't on the radar screen of the politicians in Washington, and that's, if you read your history books, you will find that that's probably why Kim Il-sung and the Russians and the Chinese decided that it was a good time to try to invade South Korea and take it over. Just a little bit of background. I see my good friend Don Mates here from Iwo Jima. If you go back to 1945, you had the battles of Iwo Jima, the Battle of Okinawa. Our good friend, God rest his soul, General Paul Tibbets, who dropped the first atom bomb in Japan. And in 1945, the war was over. At that time, 1945, okay, from 45 to 1950, they emasculated the military, they cut back on us dramatically, and by the time that June 1950 came around, the Koreans and the Russians were just bound and determined that we would not come into Korea, we being the United States, and they decided that that was a good time to invade, and they did. Going back then to the 24th of June, 1950, some people will say the war started on the 25th of June. Well, it did, because I was in California, and the war, Korea is one day ahead. So it was 5 a.m. on the 25th of June, Sunday, in Korea, and it was 5 p.m. In San Diego, California, when the war started. And it was a literal blitzkrieg. They had been planning this for some time, and tanks, artillery, for those of you who have not been to Korea, Seoul is within artillery range of the DMZ. It was just like you read about German blitzkriegs of World War II, and within a matter of days, they were almost to Seoul. Now, I have a good friend and somebody that, Jim, I just thought about him this morning, you probably ought to have on next year, who was a Marine security guard in Seoul that morning. As a matter of fact, at 5 a.m. he was driving to work for the first Sunday that he'd been there, and he saw this plane come circling around overhead, and he didn't know what it was, and all at once this plane came down and started to strafe them. That was the first time that he had seen it. And so he immediately wasn't killed, wasn't hurt. It was a Russian yak. So he immediately went to the embassy, and for the next 48 hours, it was bedlam because the women and children were in Seoul, Korea. And George Lampman, L-A-M-P-M-A-N, lives right here in Vienna. Bedlam. They destroyed the communication equipment. They took the women and children to Incheon in trucks, open trucks. There were no ships in the harbor. There was no way to get them down to Busan. They went to a Japanese fertilizer ship. They poured all the fertilizer into the bay, put the women and children on it, and they sailed around and took the women and children to Japan. The ambassador, Syngman Rhee, went down to Busan and set up the temporary White House in a place called Chinhae, and that house is still down there. And then within a matter of days, they were almost, well, I mean, there wasn't anything to stop them. There was no U.S. military there except the KMAG. The Rock Army was still relatively untested, and they just kept falling back. Fortunately, we had to give them hell Harry Truman, and he said, this is not going to stop us. He called MacArthur. MacArthur sent in Task Force Smith, Brad Smith, who later was captured and became a POW, sent in the 24th Division, 25th Division, and nothing stopped them. Finally, they were down to a place called the Busan Perimeter. Daegu to the north, the Naktong River, and they were knocking on the door. They were almost there. We landed, the 5th Marines, on August 7th, 1950, and within 48 hours, we were in hand-to-hand combat. I mean, they were bound and determined they were going to take all of Korea, and they almost did. Now, whether it was the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade or some other brigade landing, we'll never know, but we did stop them at the Naktong. We backloaded. Matter of fact, we started to backload to go around and make the Incheon landing, and the bad guys crossed the Naktong again, so we kicked them back over the Naktong the second time, and the river, the Naktong River, literally ran red in blood. There were so many people killed they were walking across the river by the Navy and Marine Corps corsairs that were there protecting us. I wanted to give you that little bit of background because a lot of people call it the Forgotten War. We call it the Forgotten Victory now. And the reason we call it the Forgotten Victory is because Russia, and then finally when China entered the war, made a huge mistake. After the Incheon landing, we backloaded, went around and landed in the Wonsan, went up to the Chosin Reservoir, and that's when, matter of fact, we went into the Chosin Reservoir, there was no opposition, little opposition, because all the bad guys were down south. MacArthur knew that. He cut the peninsula in two. And it wasn't until the Chinese entered the war that we knew that we weren't going to get to the Yalu, that we were up there, but there were more enemy behind us than there were in front of us, and that's when General Smith said, hell, we're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction because there are more behind us than there are in front of us, and we fought our way to the sea and then back out. But in the Chosin Reservoir, and I'm going to introduce the next speaker here, Medal of Honor recipient Tom Hudner. I can remember, you know, a lot of people ask me what was it like to be in the Chosin Reservoir. Well, it was 32 below zero most of the time, and that was all of the time. Not just during the day, not just during night. It was cold all the time. And we didn't even know what a wind chill factor was at that particular time. And I would suspect it was probably about 40 degrees below zero in some places up in the mountain passes. But you could never get out of the cold. And that's why we had so much frostbite. That's when we had so many people killed. They'd freeze almost immediately. Once they were hit and they'd fall, they'd freeze. Matter of fact, when we tried to take the bodies out, they were frozen in grotesque positions, so we'd have to break their arms and legs to straighten them out, to stack them in the trucks like cordwood to bring them out. So